Let's go to Mike Shellenberger. He's been on Outsiders before. He is, of course, the founder of Environmental Progress. He's an environmentalist, a scientist, an author, and we're delighted to have him again to talk to us about renewables, about nuclear energy, and give us some actual facts and science on what is the madness of the climate change religion. Welcome back to Outsiders, Mike Shellenberger. How are you, Mike?
Good, thanks for having me.
Good to see you again, mate. Now, listen, you've been writing quite a lot recently, particularly about nuclear energy. Suddenly, since we last spoke a few months ago, that debate has heated up here in Australia, with certain politicians saying, well, hang on, maybe we should be looking at this. So tell us just briefly where we are at the moment with renewables in Europe and what you think what's happening in Australia.
Well, renewables are running into a crisis situation in the countries that were the first to pioneer the use of them. So what we've seen in both Germany and California is a problem of both too much solar and wind electricity when we don't need it, not enough when we do need it. The German wind industry is actually in a crisis right now. They've lost about 24,000 jobs over the last year or so. Only 1/3 of the new wind auctions were actually sold to bidders. And the reason is because there are lawsuits and local opposition that are blocking new transmission lines and wind farms because they're having such a negative environmental impact, particularly on a really spectacular bird species, the European red kite. And it's a similar situation in California, and it's actually happening in Australia as well. There's actually 2 endangered Australian birds that are threatened by wind farms right now. So this is one of the great ironies, is that those of us that have dedicated our lives to protecting the natural environment find ourselves opposing the expansion of a technology that was supposedly good for the environment, but has turned out to have some of the biggest negative ecological impacts.
Talk us through those, particularly the larger birds and the threat to them. The environmentalists in Australia and the lefties have all gone, oh, no, the odd occasional bird maybe, but they've dismissed it. We've heard all sorts of figures about what is at stake with bird life. Talk to us about the threat of windmills.
Well, this is really quite scandalous. I mean, I was an advocate for wind turbines for many years, and I told myself, I repeated the propaganda that I had heard, which is that, oh, well, house cats kill more birds or more birds fly into buildings. That's just false. Cats might kill robins and sparrows and jays, but the big, spectacular, high conservation value birds, the birds that are endangered or threatened, the ones that take many years to reproduce, those birds don't get killed by house cats. Eagles kill house cats, as it actually turns out. And you have 2 species of endangered birds actually in Australia. We're doing a report on this that should come out in the fall, but the orange-bellied parrot and the Tasmanian wedge-tailed eagle are both threatened by wind farms. And it's major green leaders in Australia, major environmental activists that are raising these concerns. And once again, though, our concerns are being dismissed by this big lie, which is that house cats are somehow some major threat to eagles or even parrots. It's quite ridiculous.
I wanted to ask you about Germany and France, the different approaches they've taken in terms of nuclear and renewables. Talk us through that, because there's an enormous figure that Germany is going to be spending upwards of 580 billion by 2020, and yet their energy prices are soaring.
That's right. I always say that all you need to learn about energy and the environment, you can learn from Germany and France. And it's an important case study because it covers many decades. So just one statistic, Germany spends almost twice as much for electricity that produces 10 times more carbon pollution than French electricity. The Germans have seen their electricity prices rise 50% over the last decade. And like you said, Germany will spend $580 billion by 2025 on renewables. And we'll need to spend another $3 to $4 trillion to get solar and wind to 100%. And people think that Germany's mostly renewables. It's actually only 35% renewables, up from just 7% 10 years ago. And they're running into huge challenges. I mean, the biggest are the environmental and economic ones. But you can see it's a brilliant case study because Germany has been phasing out nuclear, trying to do renewables. France has stayed with nuclear at 75% of its electricity mix. And here they're actually the world climate leader and the world environmental leader, and they're doing it with nuclear power.
But Mike, one of the things that you've written about, I think, very eloquently, and Bill the cat, so to speak, or not the house cat that's killing the eagles, but just cats in general, is that for the environmental movement, actually the economics don't matter. And in some ways, ideologically, the idea that the power prices are going to go up and that a consumer lifestyle is harder to achieve is actually a feature, not a bug. Can you talk to us a bit about that deep green ideology?
Well, yeah, I mean, you hear it all the time. I mean, I traveled all around the world. I interviewed small farmers in the poorest countries in the world, and I've never heard any of them say that we all consume too much or there's too many people. But here in my hometown of Berkeley, or when I travel to rich parts of Europe or Australia or New Zealand, I hear it all the time. People say the rest of the world can't live like us, and there's something wrong with our lifestyle. I find it really disturbing because it's often claimed like, oh, well, we'll all do our part. But of course, the people that are saying it fly around the world in jet airplanes. They go to conferences to complain about other people becoming prosperous. And so I think that really what it's about is it's about actually trying to keep other people down. This is what it's been about since the 40s and 50s. All of that concern about, oh, there's too many people, that was always directed at poor people, non-whites, in poor and developing countries. And you see it now, they're using climate change to basically deny poor countries modern energy. It started with hydroelectric dams and nuclear plants, but now they're seeking to deny poor countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, the basics of oil and gas, coal, all the ways in which we have achieved this amazing standard of living. You see people trying to stop other people from having that standard of living in poor countries.
We've got that happening right here. I don't know if you've heard about the Adani mine, where the coal is destined for India. And the environmentalists want to stop a project that's going to help impoverished Indians have a better standard of living. It seems incredible.
Well, yeah, and you know it's not really what it's about because they also all oppose nuclear power. So if you really cared about climate change, you would be a huge advocate of nuclear power. Most of the great climate scientists of the world are actually the biggest advocates of nuclear power. And so I think that really gives lie to the concern that people profess for climate change. You say and of course we see it over time. First they said, oh, well, we're concerned about resource depletion. Now they say we're concerned about climate change. But at the end of the day, what they're advocating is that people stay poor in poor countries and that we increase the cost of energy and reduce our standard of living in rich ones.
Mike, just very quickly before we go, you've basically put the lie to the whole battery revolution idea. Our former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was always banging on about batteries. You don't think they're feasible. Tell us.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly expensive, first of all, and all we can do with these batteries is save electricity for a few minutes. If you were to have a grid that ran on solar and wind, you'd have to save electricity for literally weeks and months because that's how much time you have to save it. So it's really quite inefficient and unenvironmental. What is so great about electricity is that you're always balancing supply and demand. This idea of backing up and storing lots and lots of electricity just requires huge amounts of natural resource and all sorts of environmental destruction. So if you want environmental quality, you need an efficient grid, and that means a grid with very little, as little storage as needed.